Great. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another episode of PHS Live. If you're joining us for Sanctuary and Accompaniment, you're in the right place. If you're thinking about something else, you're in the wrong place. It's my pleasure to be joined by several Presbyterians who are involved in the work and witness of serving populations of migrants from Central America seeking refuge in the United States. We're here because 40 years ago, Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, publicly declared itself a sanctuary church for people fleeing war in Central America in defiance of U.S. immigration authorities, challenging us all to love our neighbor. After 5 hours of discussion at a congregational meeting in January of 1982, the vote was called 79-2 in favor. Southside would declare itself a sanctuary 2 years after the assassination of now Saint Oscar Romero. One of the action's opponents immediately reported the church to the FBI. Within a year, some 1,600 Salvadorans would transit through Southside to safe houses around the country. Over the next several years, activists in Tucson and their network of supporters would face surveillance, indictment, and prosecution for shielding and transporting refugees and asylum seekers from Central America. Their movement in defense of the poor and the stranger, against the United States' unjust immigration enforcement, and against the US war machine that provoked the migrants' flight, would be called sanctuary. It's my pleasure to be joined by the panelists in front of you. Patty Barcelo, whose family received sanctuary from Guatemala. John Fife, Minister Emeritus at Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson. Amanda Kraft, my colleague in the Office of the General Assembly, Office of Immigration Issues and Advocacy. I hope I got that right. And Mary Ann Lundy, formerly of Riverside Church and St. Luke's in Wayzata, Minnesota. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Full disclosure to everybody looking, I've passed questions along in advance to the panelists so that they knew what they were getting into. But Mary Ann, I wanted to start with you. There was, at Riverside Church, there was opposition inside your congregation to doing sanctuary. One opponent of the motion wrote of the risk of incurring tens of thousands of dollars in potential legal fees. And as a church in Brownsville, Texas had already experienced at that point. How did Riverside Church in New York get over its risk aversion?
Well, we had a really strong committee, sanctuary committee, and those persons were involved in a lot of the other work at Riverside. So they were able informally to help people understand what we were dealing with even before we voted to be sanctuary, when we were considering the whole refugee crisis and what we would do. But Riverside really, even though it seemed like we were asking all the questions about keeping ourselves safe, Riverside had always been a social justice congregation. So we were pretty clear on the sanctuary committee that if this came to a vote of the whole congregation, we'd manage to be able to answer the questions. And Bill Coffin, who was then the minister, would of course get involved. And after he was convinced, then we knew we could, we'd be able to deal with it. The financial questions seemed to fade, even though the Brownsville, Texas church had a huge problem with $50,000, I think is the base, and a number of other things. But Riverside had faced these issues before. They had a strong disarmament program, which had been very controversial for years, headed by a wonderful Cora Weiss, so that it was really interdenominational in many ways. Much of what Riverside did was. And so they simply voted after they said they felt these issues were not strong enough for Riverside to refuse to be sanctuary. And there were people who opposed it, but the vote was positive. And then when the congregation voted, it was very positive. So I think it was educating people over and over and over again. And we had a lot of printed material. And so I think that was the way, but it was hard work educating people to be confident about the movement.
Yeah, and Marianne, what were the next steps after the vote was taken?
Well, then we looked at the issues. I should say we in the Riverside Committee were going out all the time to churches all over the New York area. So we were very busy all the time. I was working for the National YWCA, which was very open and had a very open policy. So fortunately, they were really very supportive of my work, and I missed a lot of work at that time, as did others. But it was educating people. This sanctuary committee would educate people to go out and talk to churches, to talk to senators, to talk to every person within the city structures, to try to help them understand on the basis of 1980 Refugee Act, if well-founded fear of persecution was the issue. And so people had a hard time rebutting that too. So slowly we were able to build a base. And when the final vote came, it was very, very positive.
Yeah.
It was a lot of hard work. Yeah.
Yeah. John, for Southside, declaring sanctuary was a public act meant to pressure the United States government to abandon unjust immigration enforcement. You've reflected elsewhere that, quote, I had to get comfortable with the fact that we weren't going to get away with this, that the government was going to come after us, and it was only a matter of time. Can you talk about how your church prepared for the eventual blowback and how that affected your care for the people under your care? You got to unmute though.
First, it was a very personal question for each of us. And we began with a legal aid project. Refugees from El Salvador and then Guatemala and other parts of Central America were showing up because of the civil wars there. And they had desperate need for refugee status. And so how could we help with it? Well, we needed to form a legal aid project and represent them in preparing a political asylum case and representing them in immigration court. So that was pretty obvious. And I wrote a grant to the Presbyterian Church USA asking for some assistance in getting that financial assistance in getting that legal aid project underway. And they sent us an initial grant. We started, and then this Quaker rancher by the name of Jim Corbett showed up as a volunteer with that legal aid project. And after about 9 months, he came to me and said, John, nobody from El Salvador is getting political asylum. I mean, literally nobody. No matter how great the legal representation was for their case. And he said to me, John, I think we have to start smuggling refugees safely across the border so they're not captured under these conditions. Because once they're captured by Border Patrol, then their deportation back to El Salvador and possible death squads is inevitable. We can delay it with the legal action, but we can't stop it. And I basically said, really, Jim, how do you figure that? And his argument was powerful. He said, look at the abolition movement. in the United States, when runaway slaves were aided by some people of faith who formed an underground railroad and moved them to safer and safer places. And he said, as we read history, they got it right. They were faithful. And I said, well, yeah, Jim, that's how I read history. And he said, now look at the failure, almost the total failure of the church in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s to protect Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust and others fleeing Nazi Germany. And he said, that's one of the most tragic failures of church faith in history. He said, and then he looked me right in the eye and he said, I don't think we can allow that to happen on our border in our time, can we? And that was for me a question of faith. All right, John, how seriously do you take that faith you've been ordained into as a pastor of a church? And that's a tough question when it involves serious time in federal prison, right? And not only personal questions like that, but I was married with, we have 2 sons. I'm still married to my first wife, and my sons didn't turn out to be wretched little urchins. One of them's not very good. He's Presbyterian minister, but we'll take that up at another time. And so all of those questions were very personal for me, but there was the really tough pastoral set of questions too that were essential. How do I tell the congregation that I've decided to smuggle refugees across the border, and it might mean felony charges? Well, I went to this session and told them, and they said, we don't need to explain all this to the whole congregation. We're behind you. You go ahead and do it. And then as the numbers of people that we were crossing increased, Jim said to me, can we bring refugees to your church? And then that involved the session, and the session needed to inform the congregation. And there were all of the meetings and Bible studies and prayer together about those kinds of decisions. And then as the number of Central American refugees began to increase in the church, the whole church had to get involved in the care of those refugees. How do we feed them? How do we clothe them? How do we provide medical care? How do we move them to a safer place? And everybody got involved in that set of questions. And then the government came to one of our attorneys during a political asylum hearing and said, we know what you all are up to. You thought it was a big secret. It's not. The Border Patrol Intelligence knows what you're doing. Stop it or we'll indict you. And so the only resolution to that problem was to go public with what we had been doing and what we felt we needed to continue to do to save the lives of refugees and refugee families. And so that involved a 3-month process with the congregation. Met with immigration lawyers and criminal defense lawyers about the law. We met together for Bible study and prayer. We had small groups who met on a continuing basis, met together to talk about personal issues and questions of faith that were very personal for each of them. And then we took a vote by secret ballot, as you said, and there were only 2 negative votes out of the whole congregation. So we clearly felt we had made a proper faith decision. And at that meeting, someone stood up and said, well, why just us? Why can't we invite other churches to join us? And at that point, I said, to tell you the truth, I've been so preoccupied with this internal process here at Southside Church. But if you approve of this, we'll write to other churches and see if they join us. And they did. And a movement started. And when we started, I thought we were doing civil disobedience, David, because the government had threatened and said, yeah, those people are committing felony crimes, and we will, of course, indict them or arrest them if it turns out they're doing what they say they're doing. Yeah, and about a month after I had thought I was quite eloquent in describing what we were doing as civil disobedience in the tradition of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, I get a phone call, and this guy says, I'm a human rights attorney from New York, and you've got to stop talking about civil disobedience. You're not doing civil disobedience. And I said, really? I'm just waiting for the papers to indict me because the government said they're going to do that. And he said, listen, dummy. And that's a direct quote. He said, listen, dummy, you're not violating United States law. It's the United States government that's violating the 1980 Refugee Act. Every time they order a refugee from the conflicts in El Salvador and Guatemala to be deported, that's a violation of international law, United States law, and human rights. And you've got to stop talking about civil disobedience. And I said, oh, I understand, but what do we call what we're doing? And he said, I don't know, make it up. And so I went to my friend Jim Corbett, and he came back 2 days later with a paper titled Civil Initiative to distinguish it from civil disobedience. And he defined it as the legal right and responsibility of all of us under the law to directly aid the victims of human rights violations when government violates human rights. And that became the basis of the sanctuary movement. I think it's one of the reasons that it grew so rapidly and became a major resistance movement within the United States and Canada. And so during that entire process, I just have to say, and this is not Homan, it was great to be a Presbyterian pastor through that whole time. The General Assembly provided policy support for sanctuary early on after we'd just been involved a year with that movement. They gave me basically a blank check with support for the young adult volunteer program at our church and sent these amazing young adult volunteers to support the work of sanctuary in Southside and in the borderlands. When we were indicted in 1985, I get a call from the seminary president at Pittsburgh Seminary saying, we understand you might go to jail. And I said, well, yeah, that's how I understand it, Doc. And he said, well, I met with the faculty and they determined that you hadn't nearly spent enough time in studying when you were at seminary. So now if you go to jail, we're going to arrange a doctoral program for you free of cost. So that was a great offer.
Plenty of time in prison.
Yeah, the Presbytery provided my a salary for my family if I was in prison, which was incredible support. And even during the time we were indicted, the government revealed that they had tape recorded sermons and worship services in our churches on both sides of the border in their investigation. So the Presbyterian Church took the lead along with a number of other denominations in filing a lawsuit on the basis of First Amendment free exercise of religion and supported that legal suit all the way through to victory. We got a decision that said, yeah, the government had violated the First Amendment to the Constitution in investigating the sanctuary movement. So all of that was great to be a Presbyterian pastor.
John, thank you so much. We have to get our hands on those tapes for posterity, that's for sure. Patty, I wanted to make sure to get you in here and make sure that you had plenty of time to speak with us. I mean, obviously, you know, Presbyterians doing this activity took some risk, but ultimately, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the only person who was actually held in contempt and did any kind of confinement, was confined to home, was Mary Ann. I think all of the rest of y'all were scot-free. And so the gravest risks obviously are faced by you and people like your family, Patty. Can you tell us about your family's path from Guatemala through Chiapas to Arizona?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really am so happy to be here and be part of your event today. So I have been in the United States for almost 35 years. I think I lost count. But I am here as a refugee, and every time I hear that word, it just echoes in my mind, you know, what it means, and you know how I wish I could say that history repeats itself, but it really doesn't, because we've always had refugees. And I think that it's just so, it's had such an impact on me to be able to, you know, make it alive out of my country, and to see everything that everybody risked just so that I could have an opportunity to live, not to have a life, but literally to be alive. And I have never taken that for granted. And I'm still so grateful to this day for everybody that put their livelihoods at risk just to give me and my family an opportunity to be here. So we are refugees from Guatemala, and we fled Guatemala in the 80s due to the turmoil that was happening in our countries. I was very little, and I don't know what the details of the work that my parents were involved in completely, but all I knew that they were doing was that they were trying to help people to read, to write, to have food, to have medical assistance, and to have a better, you know, wage. And my father later on explained to me that those things in Guatemala were considered, you know, subversive, that they were considered to, you know, be against the government and to, in a way, want to overthrow the government. And they were just seeking the very basic necessities of, you know, that every human should have. So my dad was kidnapped and tortured. He was kept in captivity for, I think it was 3 or 4 months. My whole home was just taken by the military. And it was very hard to make anything of it when you're so little and when you don't understand why things are happening. But we were blessed enough that my mom, my dad, and brother made it to Mexico City, but left my sister and I behind for a couple of years. And in Mexico City, my mom just met some really amazing people that would forever change our lives. She met a group of Quakers, and the group of Quakers in Mexico City connected her with the sanctuary movement people, and they just, I could not believe the level of love and compassion that we were given, the level of just care that they provided to us without knowing us. And eventually my mom went to get us back at the border so that we could all come up to the US with them. And I remember walking through the desert, and I remember how we would have to hide every time that we would hear a helicopter or a plane, or we would hear noise. And, I just remember so vividly. And I remember, we were told that we were actually on our way to freedom, that I wouldn't have to sleep with my shoes on anymore, that I wouldn't have to, be hiding in the mountains, that I wouldn't have to, cry myself to sleep in fear of, getting killed every single day and not knowing if I would lose my family members. So eventually we made it. I mean, it wasn't, and I hear John tell the story of Sanctuary, and it is such a tremendous act of kindness that, I hear him, and I would like everybody to know that it is the greatest gift we were given. And it's something that I don't think they know what they did, in essence. I know they got people here, but it's not just getting people across. It's giving people life. It's giving people an opportunity to have a life, to continue to be together, to build families, and just to take one more breath of air. I mean, that is the biggest gift I was giving, and I appreciate it every single day.
Thank you so much, Patty. I know you were really little. Do you remember anything about what it was actually like to take shelter in the church and then eventually to get removed to like a more stable environment?
I do. I came from a place where everything was death, death squads, and
Yeah.
I lived in fear of dying every single day. And when we came here, we were placed in the St. Michael's Episcopal Church, and it was Joel Ireland who was at that church, and Joel was just incredibly warm. And I remember when we got there, because we got there really late in the evening, and I remember Joel was walking from the parking lot, because I was peeking out the window, and he had his red Converse, and he just had the biggest smile, and we just felt so welcomed. And I didn't trust. I was always scared, and I was thinking, this is too good to be true. Maybe this is a setup. Maybe they're gonna take us in and we're gonna be sent back. But the moment I saw everybody gathered that night and celebrating and hugging us and just, welcoming us, I just knew that it was gonna be okay. That I was gonna be able, along with the family, to, not live in fear, that every scar that my dad has on his body because of the torture was gonna heal, and we were gonna be okay. And they gave me so much that you guys have no idea what they gave me. And I'm so grateful. Like, I get so filled with, my heart just feels big and thankful for everything that the Sanctuary movement did, because it was collaboration. It was just their love, and and I see it every single day.
Amazing. Thank you. That moment where trust is really formed, where the folks gather around you and you're assured that this is not a trick, or that's really like at the essence of the ethos of accompaniment that Presbyterians in this movement are about. Amanda, the 225th General Assembly took action to declare the PCUSA to be a sanctuary church, a sanctuary denomination. What does that mean?
Well, again, I also am grateful for the invitation to be here with these esteemed panelists. Oh my gosh, there's been so much shared that really, I think, leads into this decision from this General Assembly. And I talked to two of the presbyteries, one who was the original writer of the overture, and then the Presbytery that also provided an overture advocate. So the original overture piece of business came from the Presbytery of San Jose, and Denver Presbytery also was an overture advocate for the piece of business. And it was fascinating to sort of think about where these came from, because we're in a moment where so much has changed, but so much is the same. And so, we sort of think about how do we see the way in which immigration enforcement occurs today. And if you look at those who are seeking asylum at our borders, it is operating in very similar ways, right? How do we try to dissolve these protections that we have set up? And so those who have a right to ask for those can't fully ask for them. Those obstacles continue to be seen. And as we see with asylum seekers today, because of legal backlogs, they're waiting many, many years for their cases to be adjudicated, which leaves them in a lot of limbo. And the other piece is, how does enforcement happen locally, which what we're seeing, right, is immigration enforcement happening in local communities to the detriment of the safety of those in those communities. And so when Patty's talking about this sort of upheaval in life, although not compared to the violence that she was living in Guatemala, but the upheaval, that consistent monitoring of enforcement where your family can be ripped apart, is so tragic for those personal families, but also the communities around them. And so what we saw happen sort of in 2016 and 2017 is sort of enforcement just exploded in local communities and really targeting anyone who was undocumented. Sort of this rebirth of the sanctuary movement happened. And it was this sort of beautiful growth of what we saw from the 1980s. So lots of churches involved through the interfaith community, and then walking alongside secular organizations that have really been involved in how do we walk with immigrants in local communities. And a lot of the sanctuary coalitions that we see today are led by immigrants. So again, it's this beautiful sort of weaving together the tapestry of all this work that has happened. And when I asked those two presbyteries who were involved in the 1980s in the sanctuary movement, who continue to be involved in the work of accompaniment and sanctuary today, what was so important about and significant about passing this overture? And they said it's really the culmination of all of these efforts of the church and of our partners, and walking alongside those who are vulnerable and at risk, and lifting up that voice and being able to say together, we're called to this work. It's our responsibility as citizens, but as people of faith, we're called to this work. And as a church, how do we sort of say thank you to the many people it took to get this movement going? Because Mary Ann is right, it is a hard work. But how do we also show those communities that we really are trying to be allies and walk alongside? Oh my gosh, we want to support the work you're doing. We want to be those partners who are helping make life more beautiful, more abundant, and more fulfilling, and not having folks in our community live in danger. And so it was really sort of this beautiful way of saying, as a church, this was an important ministry in the 1980s. And sanctuary has been an important ministry since the Hebrew Bible, right? So we're talking about ancient Israelite times. So, what is this sort of biblical way we're saying it? But how do we also celebrate, right, the place that we can really come together and be integral members in coalitions that are really trying to help lighten that burden and find solutions that make sense in their local contexts?
Great. Thank you for that. This may go, I'm kind of following up on something that John said, the human rights lawyer who called him and said, you have to stop saying this because the government is in the position of breaking the law. The principle is non-refoulement, right? the United States is signatory to a treaty that enshrines the right of people who are seeking refuge and asylum to not be returned to a place of danger. And yet that's just a novel idea. The idea that the government is breaking the law is a novel kind of rhetorical path, at least to me. Are there folks, I mean, in your environment that are kind of following up on that that path, that kind of that path of argument?
Is this a question to me, David?
To anybody who
To
wants to
anyone?
answer it.
I'll just take a quick answer. There are lots of legal suits. There
Yeah.
have been lots of legal suits that have been filed, and lots recently. If you look at who seeks sanctuary today, it's mostly folks who have been in the United States for a long time, who would be separated to the detriment of their family. And they spend months and months and years in sanctuary. It is no joke. It's benign house arrest. It's very challenging. And what we have seen in response to that from the federal government is then immigration enforcement to charge them for the costs of enforcing them, right? So needing to stop by the church to make sure, even though they know where they are, and being charged hundreds of thousands of dollars for their cases. So what we're seeing is now, right, those legal suits against the government, and specifically about how the remain in Mexico is a very important piece, right? We've seen lots of different suits around that response. So legally, that's one avenue.
Yeah, and I'll follow up briefly because it's important to note that you're absolutely right, David. It was a novel idea when Jim brought that paper to me in 1982. Then once we were indicted and convicted of various felonies, because we couldn't make that legal argument in the federal court where we were tried, the judge said we couldn't say anything in our defense about United States refugee law, international refugee law, conditions in El Salvador, conditions in Guatemala, or our religious faith in his courtroom. So we didn't put on a defense. We were convicted. But then we sued the United States in a civil suit immediately after our criminal trial in order to make that case. It was the government that was violating United States refugee law. And it took 3 years. But finally, the federal judge who was hearing that case gave us the right to put the Attorney General of the United States, the Undersecretary of State for Human Rights, and the head of the Immigration Department under oath and take their depositions in preparation for that trial. And within 24 hours, we got a call from the Justice Department in Washington. Wouldn't we like to reach a settlement on this matter? The last thing they wanted was those guys to have to testify under oath. And the settlement accomplished what the sanctuary movement had set out to do in the 80s. The government agreed to stop all deportations to El Salvador and Guatemala. They agreed to give everyone temporary protected status who was here without documents from those countries. And they agreed to a whole series of reforms of the political asylum process. So we did establish that legal principle in the 80s, and we think it's still valid. The problem is exactly as Amanda said, it's winding its way through layers of court proceedings.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess this leads us hopefully back to Patty. I mean, so you and your family would have gained temporary protected status at that point, but there was still like a long period of jumping through legal hoops to get you to where you're at now. Again, I know you were a little bit, can you tell us like what that kind of struggle was like?
Oh, it was very scary, especially because every time that we would check the mail, we would get letters saying that we were going to be placed in deportation proceedings. So it was I know my parents were very stressed out. And then we would pick up on that, and then we would get scared because I remember what it was like when they came into our home, when they started killing people. And that fear, no matter how little you are, you remember that. And I didn't want to go back to that. I didn't want to die. And it took about, I want to say 14 years after we arrived to actually get our political asylum granted. So it was not an easy task. And I would like to share, the day that that Judge Irene Wise actually granted our political asylum. It was a scary day because the prosecutor that was prosecuting our case, I was scared to death of him. I would hear the shoes walking in the hallway when we had hearings. And I remember that black shoes, and I could tell you exactly the steps, the sounds of his shoes against the floor. And I would just freeze. I was scared to death. And the day that we had the hearing, it was like the do or die day for us. And it was my mom, my sister, and I that went to the hearing because my dad and my brother had moved to New Jersey. So the case got split. And he told, the prosecutor told the judge that, we should be deported, that we were making up the story, and that we needed to go back home. And the Judge Wise was very polite, and she asked him to very politely to please sit down and be quiet, and that she actually did want to hear from us, what happened. And I will never forget my mom, who's sitting right here on the couch. I will never forget what she said. And it was very, this is a lesson that I learned from her, because she's so wise. And she told the judge that, thank you for listening to us and allowing us the opportunity to speak, because we hadn't been able to do so in years. And she said, when you're tortured or raped, or when they take you out of your home and kill everybody in sight, they fail to leave a receipt for you. They don't leave you with a verification that they have done those things to you. So the receipt that we had is inside. That my dad has all the marks from torture in his body. That my sister has all those scars in her knees because we were running every single day trying to hide. That I was left in a hospital for almost 60 days because I got very sick. And we don't have those receipts on hand, especially because they took us out of our home, or actually, to their mistake, they made the mistake of letting us go because they thought we didn't live there, but we lost everything at home. And the judge was so kind, and she actually seemed like she really genuinely cared about what had happened to us. And when the prosecutor was going to say something to rebut what my mom was going to say, she just said that she wasn't interested in hearing anything else, and that she was going to, withhold our deportation and grant us asylum right then and there. So it was a long battle, but thank God that somebody actually cared enough to listen to what we had to say.
Patty, that's incredible. When they torture you, they don't leave a receipt.
That's what my mom said. And I'm gonna point to her.
Thank you, Mom. I don't know if you want to be.
Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Sandra. What a piece of wisdom. Good God. Thank you for that so much. So, Amanda, as congregations engage in the process of discernment to figure out what their capacities are and what the risks are associated with becoming sanctuary churches, and I guess I could open this to the folks who have actually done operational security and information security. Amanda, you mentioned local law enforcement being kind of the leading edge of CBP and ICE enforcement. And given that there is information sharing among Department of Homeland Security and local and state law enforcement, can we talk a little bit about some of the steps that churches are going to have to get familiar with in terms of information security and operational security? And maybe John, Marianne, can you talk about some of the steps that you took back in the day to make sure that as more and more people got involved, you said your whole congregation had to take care of folks. As you get more and more people involved, how do you maintain security to protect the people under your care?
What a great question, David. And I think a lot of the wisdom that Marianne and John talked about, sort of those beginning steps, having access to attorneys, both immigration and criminal attorneys, is so important to fully understand what you're getting into. What are the risks? What are ways you can mitigate that risk? And for your congregation to be able to think about, then how do we live into this? And I think that's where coalitions are also really helpful, because maybe your church isn't the right place for physical sanctuary, right? That you can't mitigate the risks, both to the people who are seeking sanctuary or for your congregation. There might be another congregation where that makes more sense. But to really sort of plan out what that's going to look like. And David, you're a great resource for folks to also think about how to keep records secure, right? Because we, John mentioned, right, the FBI coming in. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And how do we take some steps to mitigate the records we have? Understand the populations you have in your congregations. There can be some real threats, right? If that information gets out, how do you protect that? How do you protect the integration and the safety of those who are taking on some of the risk to do this ministry? And to be open and transparent with the congregation about those pieces. But there are things you can do to keep those pieces safe. And thinking about that beforehand is really, really important, because law enforcement is often working together. And that's another piece, again, local coalitions working to be sure that local law enforcement is not doing that kind of work. What are some important ways that local communities, state communities can make decisions about how law enforcement works across different agencies is also a really important question. But thinking through, right, it's not just about maybe the intrusion of somebody coming through that door, but what are the other ways in which you could be vulnerable to that kind of monitoring is important to check out beforehand.
Yeah, Amanda's right. It's really important, David, to develop the kind of political and law enforcement relationships in your community. The way the sanctuary movement has grown since the 1980s is primarily through secular institutions, cities and counties and states who have declared themselves sanctuaries and made certain that local law enforcement does not cooperate with federal immigration authorities. And they do so on a very important principle that's not exactly faith-based. It is, what's the best law enforcement policy locally to fulfill their responsibility to protect the entire community from criminal activity? And it means that they have to build trust throughout the whole community, and you can't build trust by doing raids on families. It's a pretty simple principle. But here in Tucson, we worked closely with the city council and the county board of supervisors and the county sheriff and the county police or the city police department to make sure that they would not cooperate and train their officers not to cooperate with federal immigration authorities on the basis of public safety and their responsibilities for law and order in that community. And so it's a vital set of relationships. Actually, sanctuary movement's grown beyond all of our expectations in the United States, to tell you the truth. There are over 4,300 cities and counties who have
Yeah.
taken those steps to make sure they protect the whole population of their community, and it's vital.
Yeah. One of the things I was,
Oh, you got muted, Marianne.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was just going to say that earlier, that one of the first cities in the country that became, in this era, that became a sanctuary city was Santa Fe. And it was just near unanimous in terms of the people here. I didn't live here when the sanctuary movement was happening, and I think they were somewhat responsive. But this time, it was very clear that if authorities came to the door, the police were there to keep people safe. And that has produced a really important positive view toward refugees in this community. For a city our size, in terms of accepting refugees now, it's been just amazing. So I think it's, while we sort of thought, oh, well, that's not important. What are cities going to do? How important is that going to be? But it's been extremely important, both to the refugee families and saying to the rest of us, you ought to be doing a lot more. So it's been helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we have at least one question that has not been answered in the public chat. I have Leslie Vogel, who's asking, in the 1980s, Tucson and the surrounding county did not cooperate with CBP and ICE, but it's Leslie's understanding that the city and county do cooperate now with CBP and ICE. Is that the case?
No.
Okey-doke.
We've worked very closely with the city police department for the last 6-7 years to make sure that their general orders conform to the policy of non-cooperation. And the county has accepted some grants for law enforcement. They say overtime that are under a federal program during the last administration called Operation Stone Garden, which pays local law enforcement to be involved in border issues. And the County Board of Supervisors has rejected that grant now. But they did during the last administration for a couple of years. So it's an ongoing struggle, but a very worthwhile one if you listen to Patty at all and her mother.
Yeah. With that, I'd like to open the floor to you all for any final thoughts or parting wisdom. Patty, is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
I think education, just, spreading the word. If you see me on the street or anybody from my family, you would think that we're just from right across the border. You see people, just for people, just be kind and help each other out. And, that's what it's about,
I think in this period when there's so much division, it's really important for us to think about and express the humanitarian qualities of our life together. And maybe I'm saying that because I'm in a smaller community, but I think in being able to right now affirm those kinds of listening to each other and a sense of ministry may be the wrong word, but that we do as participants in communities have a kind of mission beyond religious concerns. I think that's what's happened a lot in Santa Fe as it's opened itself now to refugees from all over the world, really.
I think the unexpected genius of the sanctuary movement was what you've experienced here today. We only provided a safe place so the voice of the refugees and their stories and their experience was able to be broadcast throughout the community. And Patty and her family and so many other families became the voice of the sanctuary movement, not a bunch of Presbyterians or Episcopalians or even Riverside Church, although Bill Coffin did great. It is that voice and those stories that convert people. And that's what the church is all about. We're about converting folks' souls so that they respect human rights and the fundamental standards that we have all been taught to be fully human with.
Well,
Yeah, I would say, the sanctuary movement and the accompaniment that has come alongside, we live in a society that is a racialized society, and immigration through our creation of a country and as we live into who we are today has been used as a politicized topic. And so how do we break down, like Marianne is talking about, and John and Patty are talking about, how do we break down what we're told to see as those divisions? How do we walk into a place where we're open to being resilient together and to resist the way in which we're demanded to be divided? It is a really beautiful way to be able to walk together. And it is fascinating. If you walk into almost any sanctuary coalition these days, you will see people from all over the world. And what a beautiful, again, expression of how humanity comes together. And the church voice is so important in that process. And for us to be invited in and to walk alongside and to be able to practice that compassion we're called to, and to practice the way in which we have to confront the way we are divided and the way in which power corrupts, and the way at times our government acts so poorly. And then to celebrate those times where we really do find these solutions that bring about joy and bring about family reunification or bring about safety to folks who have been walking a long time without that peace on their side. So yeah, all of that together, we're better together when we can do that. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you especially to Patty and to your family, to your mom. It was an unexpected treat. Thank you, John. Thank you, Marianne. And I look forward to continuing to lift up the work of accompaniment that is ongoing among Presbyterians and everyone else along our borders and across our borders. So watch this space and stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.